So let's dive into 10th edition Rumour land once more and talk about some interesting but perhaps unreliable rules rumours. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today we're talking 10th edition Warhammer 40k once more. And today I thought I'd cover another set of rules leaks that have been sent to me by a few different people. If they wind up being accurate, it could be some interesting signs of what's to come in the game, perhaps a little glimpse of the future. So for today's rumours, we've got a source that says they know a fair bit about 10th edition rules coming up. It's a short text leak originating from Discord, and they claim to be a playtester who's annoyed with Games Workshop. As best I can tell, I think it was posted yesterday. It has been sent to me a few times since then by various people. Thank you to all of those who did. I'm not 100% sure as to the original server it was posted to. I've mainly just seen posts where it's gone to various other different Discord servers around the internet. The post at least claims to be a 10th edition playtester annoyed at Games Workshop. They use some relatively graphic language as well, saying Games Workshop effed me over, so I decided to break the NDA to F them. We don't really know whether that's truthful or they're just saying that so it sounds a bit more credible. I guess Games Workshop have annoyed a fair few playtesters, at least in the fairly recent future, by basically closing their external playtesting program to stop all the leaks. They then go on to say a fair few things about how the core rules of 10th edition might be changing. Obviously leaks like this are very easily faked. I certainly would take this with a very healthy pinch of salt, but even if this does just turn out to be someone having fun with making up some rules, it's kind of interesting to talk through, at least with the ideas of what it could mean for changing the game. Again, like the last leaks that we talked about on the channel, they do all seem kind of plausible, but it's not really too hard to make up something at least fairly plausible from Games Workshop's rules changes point of view. In any case, let's go through and have a talk about what they've said. We certainly won't know for sure though until Games Workshop start confirming rules and announcing the edition themselves. First up, the leaker said that the playtest materials that they received only included Tyranids, Space Marines and the index books. I guess this would make a lot of sense and fit in with all the other rumours that we've been having of 10th edition. In theory, we're getting Tyranids versus Space Marines as the title factions in the same way that we had Necrons in 9th edition, and the vast majority of the rumours so far have been indeed saying that we're going to be getting a full index book reset. Basically all the codexes go away and we get some new simplified rules. A bit of a hard reset for Warhammer 40k to cut down on the rules bloat drastically. It would make sense that Space Marines and Tyranids will get special attention. They're likely going to be getting their codexes early if they get all their models early. Plus they will both have a decent amount of new units to test, Games Workshop likely releasing lots of new models in the same pattern as Indomitus and Dark Imperium before it. In terms of details they say about the indexes, again there's nothing really too implausible here. I feel like this is the sort of thing that most people would have guessed anyway, to be honest. They say that the indexes are all very basic with a low number of options and upgrades. I guess we only really have the 8th edition pattern of indexes to go by at the moment, and it seems very plausible that they do something very similar to that. Specifically, they say that all armoured stratagems and warlord traits are massively scaled back from what they are in the codexes. To be honest, with index books, I wouldn't be entirely surprised if they just didn't have any unique army stratagems wholesale. That would be the pattern that they had in 8th edition, but maybe they might just slim it down to just a few options, or maybe even 8 options like the World Eaters had in their book. They similarly say that spells and prayers generally become 3 per discipline rather than the 6 per discipline that we have at the moment. Again, if this is accurate, this will be a perfect match with the previous index books that we've got. Either it's just Games Workshop keeping things a bit more simplified for those books, or they're just copying what it came before so the leaks get a bit more credibility. Again though, seems very plausible. I think it's pretty much guaranteed that a simplified index book that was a compendium of different armies would have less rules bloat than the full fat codexes that would likely follow them. Finally, overall they say that the game feels more streamlined, but having the loss of a fair bit of flavour for more simplicity. Again, kind of hard to see how that might not be the case. If you're going to put more weight on things just like raw unit stat lines and things, rather than all sorts of quirky special rules to represent their war gear or their fighting styles, I feel like you probably are going to lose a fair bit of flavour and depth, but it might not be the worst thing as the game for a whole, depending on what you want to get out of it. Again, for these ones, I'd say that these are fairly safe bets. Nothing too surprising here, perhaps. For the first major change though, there was one that I was kind of wondering whether they might be doing already. They say that subfaction rules are basically gone in 10th edition, and the general gist of it is that rather than having your armies drawn from individual subfactions, they'll get a sort of custom trait combination kind of similar to the Imperial Guard Codex. They weren't really too specific as to whether or not that would be in the actual indexes themselves, or whether that would be something that would be saved for codexes. I remember when we had the index rules back in 8th edition, there weren't any rules for subfactions whatsoever. This one would fit quite well with that previous 4chan leak, I suppose, saying that White Dwarf would announce a very different way to play chapters prior to 10th edition, and this will be a bit of a shake-up compared with the status quo at the moment. They go on to say that actual Subfactions flavour is generally relegated to certain special characters providing rules. I guess that will be things like chapter-locked special characters, giving their own warlord trait and maybe slightly manipulating the way that you could play an army. Again, once more, this could fit in kind of similar to the World Eaters book. They removed any Blood Company type sub-factions that they might have had, similar to the Death Guard or Thousand Sons, and perhaps the main decisions for the way that you play an army are choosing between characters like Angron or Lord Invocatus to lead them, both of which could push the army in very different ways. If Games Workshop did wind up doing this, I genuinely wouldn't be too surprised. Similar to Imperial Guard, it could be a way of allowing people just to use their collections and always gain access to the best rules that they can. Even if you happen to have painted your Space Marine chapter in one way, it means that if they're lumped with subpar rules for a bit, you're not pressured to play something that's worse than normal for Space Marines. I guess it would also go with their general aim to try and cut down rules bloat, though again I kind of feel like it might be a bit of a sad flavour loss for some armies. I feel like, say, some of the Space Marine chapter codexes have done rather well at making their armies interesting and different. Say, armies like Salamanders getting massive buffs to their Melter, and Blood Angels getting huge buffs to their combat. Or say, Ultramarines incentivizing you to play things like Bolters that rapid fire out to maximum range. I guess for the chapters that receive some fairly weaker rules, though, by comparison, like Imperial Fists, this kind of change might not be the worst. I feel like it will be kind of a hard job to release 11 different Space Marine chapters and all have them viable and kind of equal, while also giving them very different and divergent rules. I guess perhaps my main concern from a rules point of view like this might be that it just leads to a few really best builds like the Imperial Guard Codex. There do seem to be just a lot of regiments out there that just stick with their Born Soldiers regimental doctrine and don't bother with the vast majority of the rest. I'm also not sure how they balance it with Space Marine chapters as well. Some chapters have a whole ton of unique units like Blood Angels, Space Wolves, or Dark Angels. I kind of feel like this will be hard to balance with them just having a flat more options but also access to the same generic rules as the other chapters, so it would be interesting to see how that works out there. Obviously, we don't know whether this entire leak is in any way accurate, so not exactly worth stressing about at the moment, but given the last few codexes of 9th edition, it certainly seems plausible that Games Workshop could do something like this. Next up, they mentioned that a few common upgrades were consolidated into the core book, things like having 3 stock warlord traits and some generic stratagems as well. A few more options that are just very common to armies throughout the game, so it might make sense to put them in the core rules as opposed to having every single race having their different version of the same upgrade. First up, they specifically mentioned 3 different warlord traits, one to refund command points, one for a +1 to their save, and one for a mastercrafted weapon, which I guess will be a +1 damage. I'd say that one's perhaps a fairly safe bet, to be honest. With the last few editions of Warhammer 40k, they've generally had some generic warlord traits printed in the book. They tend to be a little bit on the underwhelming side, so only some factions make use of them. I imagine like through 8th and 9th edition, they'd probably just get codex creeped as interesting ones from the factions came out, things that apply a little bit more specifically to your given army. A command point farming one does seem like quite a handy one to have as a generic pick though. They tend to be really quite popular ones, so allowing that to all factions across the board seems at least fairly sensible. Otherwise, and perhaps a bit weirder, they say that there's a few more generic stratagems added to the game, things that are kind of common across a fair few armies, things like characters fighting on death, or Spec Scan, the one that allows you to intercept an enemy unit coming in from reserve nearby, and a combat revival one that allows you to resurrect a model or models, provided you've got a unit with the medic keyword. I suppose shifting a few more generic stratagems like this could be a reasonable way to reduce the mental load on people. The ones from the core book that get used fairly regularly, things like Overwatch, interrupting in combat, or auto-passing morale, all of those do generally tend to be kind of intuitive if you see them on the board quite a bit, and people generally get it into their heads that there's the risk of that happening in-game. I guess Games Workshop could make a bit of a tactical choice to have less stratagems in the individual codexes and more in the core rulebook if they still wanted some fun and powerful rules in place with command points. In practice, though, I do feel like this could be at least a little bit tricky to implement. I guess the Auspex scan would have to be quite specific as to which units it can work on and which units it can't. I'd guess it might be things like core infantry units that can use it game-wide. I guess that probably wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. But perhaps that combat revival one just seems a little bit hard to work out. I guess you need rules that varies between the factions with really big chunky models where you only want them to resurrect one of, compared with more hoardy armies where it would be a bit more appropriate to resurrect multiple models rather than one. I feel like in terms of these rumours and predictions though, this one seems perhaps a little bit more out there, but definitely not undoable if Games Workshop really did look through every army and what units these might apply to, and were able to unify them under some likely keywords. Finally, for another couple of potentially interesting changes, there was a couple of rumours for objective scoring and a turret weapon keyword that applies to most vehicles throughout the game. This leak says that objective secured for the troop squads is just gone altogether, and objectives are instead scored by the starting number of wounds of models on the objective. So I guess unless there's any major shake-ups, Space Marines would have 2 and Terminators would have 3, for example. They also say that troops just count as double for this now, so they'd have a solid bonus over their opponent when trying to hold in a point, but wouldn't be insurmountable. I think when you're talking infantry versus infantry, that might make sense. It does seem a bit strange that, say, one Orc boy could hold an objective over 5 Chaos Terminators if they were both on the point. Definitely doesn't really make sense in terms of the mass of scary models that you have there to claim the objective. But on the other hand, the objective secured rule is really quite a powerful incentive to run troops in the army, and I feel like that's generally been quite an interesting tool to incentivise their play compared with other slot choices. The other thing that I feel would be a bit weird with this rule would be how you'd implement it for big vehicles and things. If there's no other subtleties or exemptions for vehicles or monsters, you could just say put an Imperial Knight on an objective, its starting wounds would be 24, so you'd be kind of unlikely to outscore that even if you had a whole bunch of troops. I'm not necessarily saying that that's entirely inappropriate, they are big and scary and I wouldn't like to argue with one over an objective, but I guess maybe some sort of like scaling system for monsters and vehicles might be a bit more sensible. Maybe saying something like Titanic units count as 10 models, regular vehicles as 5, and small vehicles as 3. I feel like that might be a bit easier to balance against the infantry perhaps. I guess we also don't know whether the entire wound system might be kind of heavily reworked, things might just have a whole load less wounds as well, which might make that issue a bit less problematic. Finally, the last bit of this supposed leak actually said something quite specific about vehicles in 40k. Apparently a whole load of vehicles and monsters would gain some equivalent of the turret weapon keyword, the one that's a special rule in the Imperial Guard Codex, and allows tanks to be a bit more functional even when the enemy are trying to assault them. The way that this rule works at the moment is that if, say, you've got a Lehman Russ tank that's tied up in combat with some demons or something, you can still fire the turret weapon against something else, but if it's a heavy weapon, it will be taking a -1 to hit penalty. It does mean that just by tagging a tank with some light infantry or something, you don't entirely shut down its ability to damage things that are elsewhere on the board, if the tank really just doesn't care about being in combat and is happily just going to sit there and keep on firing. I'd guess they're probably referring to that bit of the rule as opposed to a +1 to hit which the turret weapons get at the moment. I feel like this could be a fairly interesting middle ground compared with vehicles at the moment, who would basically have to target all of their guns at the unit that they've been charged by, even if you are playing with a really big battle tank against something that you really don't care about being in combat with. They say that the vast majority of vehicles in Warhammer 40k have at least one weapon with this rule. Don't know how this would work in practice with things like, say, dreadnoughts and walkers with their arm-mounted weapons, might be a bit weirder with those, but if this one's accurate, I feel like that's a pretty reasonable change for a bunch of other factions' tanks. I think it's done okay with the Imperial Guard Codex in that you can afford to be just a little bit more aggressive with Lehman Russes and things, even if combat does still have its big downsides. I don't think I'd be too against that rule change if it did wind up being a thing. Could be an interesting rules change that allows tanks to be a bit more shock attack things on the front line, as opposed to having to cringe behind screening infantry or something. Overall though, a few interesting bits and bobs there. As I've said throughout the video, certainly take with massive heaps of salt. It definitely could all be made up, but I feel like at least some of the proposed rules are interesting enough to be worth talking about. I'd be interested to hear your guys' takes on these proposed rules. Which ones of them would you like to see or not see in 10th edition? And when taken on the whole, how plausible do you think that these rumours are? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I will try and cover any news and rumours of 10th edition's rollout. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, which is how I can keep regular 40k videos like this coming quite so regularly. I try and give channel patrons a fair few advantages as well, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.